All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to tackle one of the biggest and, let's be honest, sometimes most intimidating parts of academic life: integrity. This isn't just about a bunch of rules you have to follow, it's about building your foundation as a scholar that people can trust and respect. So, have you ever looked at the rules for APA, MLA, or Chicago and just felt your brain start to melt a little bit? Yeah. If that's you, you are definitely in the right place and you are not alone. It can feel like a maze, but I promise we're going to give you the map. So here's our game plan. We're going to start with the big why behind research ethics, then get practical with how we protect people in studies. After that, we'll decode the language of citation, figure out how to choose the right style, and we'll wrap it all up by tackling the biggest pitfall of them all: plagiarism. First things first, before we get into any of the nitty-gritty of how to do things, we really need to understand the why. These are the ethical principles that are the bedrock of any credible research. Think of this as your moral compass. You know, these principles didn't just appear out of thin air. They were actually born from some pretty dark moments in history. Horrific research abuses that came to light during the Nuremberg trials after World War II forced a global conversation, which eventually led to the ethical framework we all use today, known as the Belmont Report. In that whole framework really stands on three core pillars. First, respect for persons. It's simple. People get to choose for themselves, period. Second, beneficence. It's a fancy word that just means your research should do more good than harm. And third, justice. Make sure the risks and rewards are shared fairly among everyone. These are the absolute cornerstones of ethical research. Okay, so we've got these big, important ideas, but what do they actually look like in the real world? This next part is all about putting those ethics into action, how we protect the actual human beings who participate in our work. And the number one tool we use for this is informed consent. I really want you to focus on that word process. This is so much more than just getting someone to sign a piece of paper. It's a real, ongoing conversation that makes sure a person truly understands what they're agreeing to, from the beginning all the way to the end. And that process really breaks down into these three key steps. First, you lay all your cards on the table. You explain everything, no secrets. Second, you make sure they actually get it. You use simple, clear language, not a bunch of jargon. And third, you make absolutely sure their decision is 100% their own, with no pressure at all. So when we say provide information, what does that actually look like? Well, it's all of this stuff. You have to spell out what you're doing, what the risks might be, how their information will be kept confidential. And this is a huge one. You have to make it crystal clear that they are free to walk away at any time. That right there reinforces that it's a choice, not a locked-in contract. Okay, time to switch gears. We've covered the ethics of doing research, so now let's talk about the ethics of writing about it. That's where citation comes in. It's really just a standardized language we all use, to be honest, and give credit where credit is due. I love this quote because it just nails it. All those tiny, picky formatting differences between citation styles, they aren't just random rules somebody made up to make your life difficult. They actually exist for a reason. Each style is designed to highlight the piece of information that a particular academic field thinks is the most important. And here's the perfect example of what I mean. In the sciences, where you'll see a lot of APA style, knowing when something was published is everything. Is this data from last month or last decade? Big difference. But in the humanities, using MLA, you're often doing a close reading of a book. So you need to point your reader to the exact page you're talking about. See? Different values, different formats. It makes sense. Which, of course, brings us to the big practical question. How in the world do you know which one to use? So let's get down to it. Think of this chart as your quick start guide, your cheat sheet. Writing a psychology paper? You're probably going to be using APA. Analyzing literature? That's MLA's home turf. Writing about history? Chicago's style is likely your go-to. It's a great place to start figuring out where you stand. But here it is, the single most important rule of them all. If you forget everything else, just remember this. Whatever your professor's assignment guidelines say, or whatever the journal you're submitting to says, that's the law. Their rules always win. Always check the specific instructions first. All right, we're on to our final and honestly most critical section. Understanding plagiarism isn't just about avoiding getting in trouble. It's about upholding the very integrity of your own work and really the entire academic community. And it's really important to get this. Plagiarism isn't always this simple black and white thing. It's way more nuanced. And believe it or not, a lot of it happens by accident. So Knowing the different types is your absolute best defense against falling into one of those traps. So let's start with the most blatant one, global plagiarism. This is basically buying a paper online or paying someone to write it for you and then putting your name on it. It's a deliberate act of deception, and it's the most serious form of academic misconduct. The solution? Yeah, it's pretty simple. Write your own papers.
Next up is verbatim plagiarism. This is the classic copy and paste job. If you use someone else's exact words, they absolutely have to be inside quotation marks, and you have to cite the source right there. It's an easy mistake to make, but it's also incredibly easy to fix.
Now, this is probably the #1 most common type of accidental plagiarism. You read a great idea, you put it into your own awesome words, and then you just forget to credit the original source. You have to remember, even if the words are yours, if the idea isn't, you have to give credit. Patchwork plagiarism is a little more subtle. It's like you're creating a mosaic. You take a phrase from this source, a sentence from that source, and you weave them together. But if you don't give a citation for each individual piece of that mosaic, it's still plagiarism. And finally, the one that surprises a lot of people, self-plagiarism. You can't submit the same paper or even big chunks of it for 2 different classes without getting explicit permission from both instructors. It seems weird, right? But the logic is that you should be getting credit for new work and new learning each time. So what's the big takeaway here? What does all this boil down to? It's really this simple formula. When you combine those core ethical principles for how you conduct your research with the intellectual honesty of how you write it all down, that's what equals scholarly integrity. That's the goal. And that leaves us with one final, pretty massive question. We just covered principles that were built up over decades. But now, we're living in an age of AI that can generate text in a split second. So how do we uphold these timeless values of integrity in this brand new world? Well, that is the challenge for all of us.